All right, it's MOvember. It's just past midnight. I missed one yesterday, but today was the 25th, and in Australia it was White Ribbon Day, and it was about stopping domestic violence and men's violence towards women and children, and I think to other men too. In gay relationships there can be domestic violence, so violence is a huge problem in relationships, in culture, in sexuality, and but I think the focus of being men's violence towards women is because it's a majority of the violence, and it's something that I want to talk about here in a bit of a download of I'll go over a rage iceberg, talk a little bit about it. Where to start's always hard. I grew up in a family of rage. It was my mother who was the rager. She was mentally ill, and she would have explosions of rage. I saw her try and chop down the back veranda one night with an axe because my father hadn't done renovations. I saw her throw bottles through windows and hit him in the face, and I had no idea what was happening. And what I do know is what ended up as a result of that is I have a complex post-traumatic stress when it comes to violence. I was out tonight seeing the Cult. Some of those guys are in recovery. They were over here in Australia. It was awesome to see them. The new album's fantastic. And but there was an incident where a guy came and stood too close to me, and as I asked him to move, I saw him get aggro. And I'm pretty good at being passive, but I could feel that PTSD reaction, and I had to breathe and just talk myself through it. And he was drunk, and I thought, this is how this stuff happens. And so we moved away, and I thought, man, I haven't had a fight since I was 12 years old. I've always been frightened of fighting. But it would just remind me of White Ribbon Day and the need to talk about it. So I'll do my best to talk about it. So I'm going to go over on the whiteboard. So let me try and get this. I hope this makes sense to you folks. Some of the stuff I've drawn before for you is, when we're talking about an iceberg, what we're basically saying is rage is a behaviour. It's not a feeling. And so when people rage and they get violent, it's commonly thought, that this is anger, but it's not. Rage is an accumulation, and it's accumulation firstly of sort of toxic states of feeling. So we have adult appropriate states of feeling, and that can be joy and love and fear and pain and anger and guilt and shame, just to name the primary colours. But then what can happen is that if you grew up in a family system where you were either carrying the feelings of others, had feelings shamed into you, or been around people acting irresponsibly with their feelings, then essentially we end up with a toxic level of feeling. And it's just the best word I can use to describe it. It's an hysterical level of these feelings. So in other words, even joy can end up where we feel enmeshed. Sorry, let me say that again. I'm not going to rewind this thing. Joy is where we end up where we can be hysterical. So it ends up in a bit of hysteria, because some families it wasn't okay to be enjoyment and in the moment spontaneous. You got backhanded by an alcoholic mother or father when you were just playing and making a noise and being rambunctious and boisterous. Love can mean that we feel enmeshed. So it feels engulfing. Fear can end up with panic or terror. Pain can end up where we feel depression. Anger is where it turns into rage. Guilt can be where we end up so isolated and alone. And shame is a sense of worthlessness. So what happens is when this toxic energy is there and it's got nowhere to go, it ends up in what we call resentment. So this builds up and doesn't go anywhere. Now, what is resentment? Resentment is simply, apparently, in the old French language, to refeel. And why do we refeel? Well, we're essentially up at a thought level. For a lot of folks with complex post-traumatic stress, untreated trauma, is that we've got a lot of history untreated. And not only is it untreated, it's been minimized, it's been denied, and we can even have delusion about it. Now, for the real PTSD, we can have memory loss, completely gone. So in this history, even just filtering that down, once that's gone through that filter, for what we've even got left, we can usually have a locus and focus outside of us. So we focus away. So we focus on the other. And if I can make sure that either you're okay, then I can be okay. But essentially, this history, if it's untreated, it will leave us with a lot of core beliefs. And core beliefs can be things that get triggered that are about either our value, our safety, our identity, or our dependency, our needs and wants. And so when these are triggered, we'll have statements like, I'm unlovable, I'm not good enough, I'm unsafe, I'm not worthy of support, I'm insignificant. And so when they get triggered, then we assign a meaning generally that will be based on a focus away from us. Why do we do that? Because we don't want to feel any of this. Because all of that accumulated and swirling around and just getting messy comes down into this rage. And people either rage and they're violent, they can rage and be sort of silent in their violence, and they can turn it onto others, or they can turn it onto themselves. John Bradshaw made the point when he talked about toxic shame. He said that look, if you really want someone to shame me, stand back and let an expert have a go. And what we know with Pia Melody's model is the adult adapted child its job is to attack, criticize, and abandon their wounded sense of self. And so this is why this stuff builds and builds. Now, essentially, what we know now that we didn't know is that with the complex stress, is that at a body level, we essentially have a limbic system reaction. So this limbic reaction puts us into fight, flight, and freeze. And depending on what scientists you want to listen to, Dan Siegel talks about sort of fainting. Pete Walker, whose book I love, I've been recommending it all through here, so I'll continue to recommend it. Complex Post-Traumatic Stress from Surviving to Thriving. He talks about the fawning that happens, and well, essentially what happens with this fawning is this locus and focus on the other is, I need to make you okay. So I will either go into a hero role to do that, I'll go into a scapegoat role to get negative attention to do that, I'll go into a lost child role to try and disappear to do that, I'll go into a mascot role to try and disappear. But all these things sort of fit into that fawn category, that I'm going to somehow make this okay. So essentially, when we get this fight, flight and freeze, what happens there? Because this stuff's built up, it's in us. But when that's triggered from some sort of event, so if we simply get a trigger, and this is why Pete Walker says we've got to find out what those triggers are. We've got to have ourselves a heads up. You know, if it's violence, if it's a stern look, what Dr. Stephen Porges says is that we're hardwired to look at that social engagement of the face, the tone of the voice. We pick up perceived threat. Tonight I could see that perceived threat in that guy. So what happens is we will go into, and generally have a preference where we go into a fight, flight or freeze. Pete Walker talks about that in that trauma type, so I've presented that already. So what happens, instead of getting into our cognition and having our frontal cortex, as Dan Siegel says, is that we end up flipping our lid. He talks about having our limbic system, the hand model of the brain, and when this fires, when that trigger fires this limbic system, we lose that executive functioning, because we go into that part of our body, that subcortical part of the nervous system that's meant to put us into high alert and vigilance, and we will fast track down to behaviour. And so that rage, either internally or externally, will be that fight or flight. If we freeze, we temporarily just shut down and go into a dissociative disorder. And that can generally not necessarily be dangerous to others unless we're driving or doing something where we really need to be functioning executively. Or it can be that time, as Dr. Alan Shaw talks about, where we go into that implicit dread and overwhelm, and we're a threat of suicide. So when we just talk about, I always get overwhelmed when people just want to do anger management and just do boundaries, because trying to just boundary this it's a huge job, but we've got to start somewhere. That's what Pia Melody says, is that we have to, that boundaries are the first tool we need to have, because I've got to learn to contain myself and protect myself from others. And so in this reaction, sometimes I let others abuse me, or I can be abusive to others. So we either become a doormat or an offender. So we've got to try and learn boundaries. And this is why I always think it's so difficult to do this on our own. I can have an internal boundary so I contain this inside of me, but I have got to take it somewhere. I'm going to go crazy. I've got to feed this energy, these core beliefs, these roles I'm in, and these toxic level of feeling. It's got to go to some level of support. Now, I don't think it matters if it's a higher power, if it's a therapist, if it's peers, but we've got to get over that awkwardness of revealing ourselves. We can't save our face and our ass at the same time. Over time, we learn how to discharge the feelings. Over time, we learn how to combat those core beliefs with positive affirmations, but we need to do the shame reduction around the trauma. Over time, through effective subcortical techniques like brain spotting, radical exposure therapy, trauma release exercises, trauma-focused yoga, we get to actually relieve the body of the stress. And just through that mechanical act of breathing, it gates that lower vagal system when we go into fight and flight and takes us out of this. So essentially all of those ongoing mindfulness and learning how to be in our system and soothe it is a really important part of treatment. So if you're out there and you're struggling with anger and rage, days like White Ribbon are meant to bring awareness. But if you're struggling with rage, trying your hardest to stop it and you can't, it's because it's an incredibly complex situation. Please reach out for support. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be a lot easier than living with that shame when we offend people that we love. Take care.